So hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Nita Upadhye. I am the managing attorney here at NNU Immigration. And thank you for joining our Lunch and Learn this afternoon on the 25th of April. We're going to talk about renunciation of U.S. citizenship. And we're going to cover the U.S. immigration considerations. So this is sort of a high-level discussion. We won't have time to get into a lot of detail, but I want to cover as much as possible for you in this brief half hour. This Lunch and Learn will be recorded, so you can go back to it, or for any colleagues who may not be able to be here, they can listen in on the recording. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll try to get to any questions that you have at the end of our Lunch and Learn time. So thanks again for being here with us. These are the practical discussion. This is the practical discussion that we'll have today. So these are the questions that I'd like to cover in this brief half hour. So I'd like to talk about why people give up citizenship. Why do they make the decision to give up their US citizenship, or what are some of the common reasons? I'd like to also cover whether you can travel and work freely in the United States after giving up your US citizenship. I'd like to talk about how family members are affected, if they're affected by your decision to give up citizenship. We'll also talk about, can you renounce on behalf of a US citizen child? Next, we'll talk about any criminal convictions. If someone has any sort of police record or caution, arrest, or conviction anytime in the world, anywhere in the world, anytime in their life, will that impact their ability to get into the United States after renunciation? We'll talk about whether you can give up your US passport while you're physically in the US on US soil. The brief answer there is no. We'll talk about whether you can get back your citizenship. If you've made that decision, can you reverse that decision? We will then talk about whether the government can ever say no. Could they ever just say, no, we're not going to let you give up your US passport? We'll then talk through procedures for the renunciation of citizenship. And a common question that comes up is, how quickly can you renounce your US citizenship? Great, so why give up citizenship? So the common reason that people give us when they come to us to say, I'm interested in giving up citizenship, I'm considering it, is the main reason is really to reduce administrative burdens. For most applicants, their decision to renounce is driven around, wanting to simplify their lives. They've got their homes, careers, their lives outside of the US, and maybe they have been abroad for decades and maybe most of their adult life. And so they realize that it is becoming more and more of an administrative burden and a stress and strain on their lives to have to report their worldwide earnings to the IRS, to have to file FBARs, and all the reporting obligations that come from being a US citizen. And so while they also realize that they're going to give up rights and privileges, they realize that they're weighing the pros and cons and come to the rather difficult decision that perhaps it is best for them to give up their US passport. So one of the big downsides of doing that is, there's just generally less freedom of movement into the United States. So, the obvious downside is that they can't just pick up at a moment's notice and go to the US for any sort of business-related trip or personal trip. Now, they can potentially work in the US, but they would have to go through the same lengthy process that everybody else would have to go through to get work authorization. So again, the big downside, less freedom of movement, and someone's no longer able to travel and work freely in the United States. Let's talk about the impact on work and travel. So as I just mentioned, that you can't travel and work freely in the United States, and you'd have to qualify for an employment-based visa. That can take months, and some companies may not want to sponsor people for visas and go through the extra cost associated with that. So sometimes we have clients who come to us to say, I'm interested in giving up my US citizenship, but I want to make sure that I can continue to travel to the United States. And I work for a global company. So there might be the need for me down the road to go on business trips, or if I need, if there's a project that I need to be in the US for, I could see a world where I might need to go and work in the US. Will I be restricted from doing so? And we tell them, no, you won't necessarily be restricted from travel unless there are certain exceptions there, but you will have to go through the lengthy employment-based visa process. You would have to qualify and be eligible for a particular work-related visa, and a company would have to pay the necessary costs to getting you out to the United States. Now, someone can travel as a visitor under ESTA. So ESTA is the electronic system for travel authorization. It's an online application process, and it's valid generally for two-year period. And so someone can still travel under ESTA for a business trip as long as they're not working on that trip. And they can travel for holiday visits and visits to see friends and family, as long as they get ESTA authorization. And typically ESTA authorization, the authorization is for 2 years, and each entry upon each admission, one gets a 3-month stay in the US. Now there's one caveat to that, and that is if anyone has any sort of prior police history, however minor it is, you want to get that evaluated, because if someone has even as little as a caution, a police caution, and certainly an arrest or possibly a conviction, that really needs to be looked at, because while someone might have been able to travel with this caution or arrest or conviction as a US citizen, once you apply for a visa to enter the US, that's going to be examined closely, and you could be deemed inadmissible into the United States. So before giving up citizenship, you want to assess whether you have any complications in your history that would keep you from entering the United States. The other point is that you want to speak to your tax lawyer about any tax implications of working in the United States following renunciation, because clients who come to us say, look, I don't want to have to file US tax returns anymore. I pay all of my tax in the UK. I'm a law-abiding citizen, but I really don't want to be in the US tax net anymore. So you want to look at whether if you get work authorization, whether you will fall again into the US tax net and whether you will be deemed a tax resident. So it would be advisable to talk to your tax lawyer if you are looking to get work authorization in the US down the road after giving up citizenship. Talk to that tax lawyer about what, if any, tax implications there might be associated with that. Next, I'd like to talk about the impact on family. So generally, qualifying family members could no longer be sponsored for green cards if you give up your US citizenship. And so giving some examples here, if you're a US citizen and you have children who are born outside of the United States, if you meet certain tests, and the main test is that you have been residing in the United States for 5 years, 2 of those years after age 14. If you meet that physical presence test in the United States and you move abroad and you have children abroad, you could transmit your US citizenship, to the children, meaning that the children would at birth be deemed US citizens, even though they're not born in the United States. So you would no longer have that right to transmit citizenship to foreign-born children. And even if you don't meet that test of 5 years residing in the US 2 years after age 14, you could still sponsor them for green cards if you are a US citizen. But of course, if you give up that citizenship, you'd no longer be able to do that. And equally, if you've got a foreign national spouse, if you give up citizenship, then the spouse would not be eligible for a marriage-based green card. Now, a spouse or even children could have other ways of getting into the United States well, the spouse perhaps could get work authorization. For children, it could be more difficult, maybe student visas. So there are other routes potentially for getting into the United States. But if you as a US citizen give up your citizenship, that one route is no longer available. Now, some clients come and ask us about renunciation on behalf of a child. They might have a US citizen child, and they want to, and perhaps that child was born outside of the United States or born inside the United States, but they no longer live in the United States. And a parent could be concerned for inheritance purposes that the child no longer have US citizenship. They may want them to give up citizenship. So there have been times when clients have come to us to say, could we do this on behalf of our child? And the brief answer is no. A parent cannot renounce on behalf of a child. Renunciation must be done voluntarily. There can't be seen as being any duress or undue influence. It must be done on one's own free will. And so a parent can't do that on behalf of a child. Further, a child is not deemed to have mental capacity to understand the ramifications of loss of nationality. So if a child is a US citizen, they're going to have to wait until age 18 before a US embassy abroad will accept their application. There's some case law to suggest that after age 16, there could be the embassy could see them as having the mental capacity to understand what they're doing, but they may need to get that special kind of review from the State Department in Washington if they had a child age 16 come to them to give up citizenship. So the Legal Affairs Office in Washington might have to review that. But at age 18, one is freely able to renounce citizenship on their own. Now, there is a provision that allows an 18-year-old to reverse that decision up until age 18 and a half. So normally, a decision to renounce citizenship is permanent. It's irreversible. It's irrevocable. One couldn't give up citizenship and days or weeks or months or even years later say, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have done that. I now want to take myself and the family to the US. What can I do to get that citizenship back? And barring some sort of judicial review or judicial decision, whereby the individual might say, I didn't have the intent and I wasn't aware of what I was doing. I mean, that's a difficult case to make, but barring a judicial decision, that is a permanent decision. And one could be eligible to apply for a green card again, and maybe go through the process of getting a work visa and then getting sponsored for a green card and then eventually qualifying for citizenship again. But they couldn't simply, contact the US government and say, "Ooh, could you give me my passport back, the one that I gave up a few years ago?" The exception here is for one who is 18 years old at the time of renouncing citizenship, and then perhaps they've realized that that wasn't a good decision. They have a few months to change their mind. Let's talk about the procedures for renouncing US citizenship. So this is governed by section of the Immigration and Nationality Act 34985, and that governs the right of US citizens to renounce citizenship. Now, I mentioned, may not have mentioned in one of the other slides, but this must be done abroad, meaning outside of the United States. One could not give up US citizenship while they are physically on US soil. So it must be carried out outside of the United States. And it must be conducted in person before a diplomatic officer. That is the formal route for renouncing US citizenship, is appearing at a US embassy outside of the United States in person for renunciation. And you must sign an oath of renunciation. Typically, you will verbalize that oath of renunciation, and you're required to surrender your US passport. And you're doing so with the intent to renounce all rights and privileges associated with US citizenship. Another key component of going through the procedure is they want to know that you have a foreign nationality and you're not going to be rendered stateless. So we have, all of our clients have dual nationality, and some might have even more than that. They might have a third passport as well, but at the least they must have at least one other foreign nationality to be able to then give up their US passport. A question that often comes up is, how quickly could I do this? So we've had clients come to us to say, this is actually now more urgent than we once thought, because of some, perhaps some upcoming taxable event. So one might be, selling a house and or selling a business, and they might get a windfall from that sale, and they may not necessarily want to the U.S. government to get a piece of that profit. So they might ask, how quickly can this be done? And we have a discussion with the client first about, the purpose. Do they understand that this is irreversible, irrevocable? Do they understand that they cannot work or travel as freely in the United States? They understand that they can't transmit citizenship or otherwise sponsor family members for green cards. Do they understand what they're giving up? Do they understand they no longer can vote in federal or state elections, etc.? And if they do clearly understand that and understand that they can't change their mind, then we look at what are the options for getting them into a US embassy. And some say, well, okay, so I'm residing here in the UK, do I have to go through the US embassy in London? And the short answer is no. You don't have to go to the US embassy in the country in which you're residing. And so we've been able to take advantage of more favorable timelines in other embassy posts. And so we've made calls around and tried to understand and learn about procedures at other embassies. And some of them have been open to accepting US citizens in their jurisdiction, even if that US citizen is not residing in their jurisdiction. And that really has to do with their own management decisions, with the resources that they have available. Maybe they do have the ability and capacity to take on that work, and so they're willing to, but that door could always shut. They might say, look, we're now busy servicing US citizens in our jurisdiction, and we cannot accept others outside of it. And so these sort of rules and policies can change. But it is feasible and possible for a US citizen who lives in the UK to go to Malta, for example, or to go to Italy, or to go to another European country. We've been successful with sending clients, especially during the kind of post-pandemic, while embassies were catching up on their workloads. London was heavily backlogged and still is with renunciation. And so we started contacting other embassy posts, explaining who we were and what we were trying to achieve. And we had success with the US Embassy in Malta. We've also had success in Florence. At one point, I think we pretty much contacted every embassy post in the world to get the most favorable timeline. And we were able to get someone into Yerevan, Armenia, and they were willing to take 2 flights to travel there to get out of US citizenship. And that was actually a successful trip. And we've used several other embassy posts. Some clients are willing to travel and do whatever necessary, and others say, I'm not in such a rush, I'll wait until London has openings. And our understanding about London is that you can, one puts themselves on a waiting list, and then some sort of online process, and then they get contacted to, their date is up and they can then appear at the embassy. Now, in terms of documentary requirements, every embassy is slightly different, but there are common requirements. And so there are certain forms typically that the embassy will require. And so those forms have to be completed carefully. And then they typically want evidence of any name change. So if someone has changed their name due to marriage, they want to see the marriage certificate. They'd like to see the birth certificate, whether it is a birth certificate in the United States or a foreign birth certificate. If someone has a foreign birth certificate but they were born dual nationals, so British citizen, for example, was also born an American citizen, then they want to see the consular report of birth abroad. And that's sort of effectively the American birth certificate issued by the US Embassy abroad. And then again, marriage certificate, passports, copies of passports, we present that to the embassy. And then of course the original passports have to be presented in person at the interview. And those are the kinds of documents that have to be presented. Sometimes we get clients say, I don't know where this document is. I don't know where my birth certificate is or where my consular report of birth abroad is. How do I get a hold of that? And we can usually advise on what government office you need to contact to get that document. But if it takes several months, then you have to factor that in. But you want to go fully documented. This is a very solemn, serious occasion to give up citizenship, and you don't want to go without full documentation because they won't think that you're taking this process seriously. So we make sure all of our clients get all of the documents that they need, and sometimes it might not need to be presented, but you want to be documented and make sure you have everything that could be asked for at that appointment. And at the appointment, now some consulates require a pre-appointment phone call. So they want to actually speak to the person who is interested in giving up citizenship. They want to talk to them about why they're doing it and get an initial feel for, is this person serious? Do they understand what they're doing? Do they know that, again, this is not a process they can reverse? And so if they then get assurance from that sort of phone interview that the person is well aware of what they're doing, then they'll give an appointment for that final renunciation interview. There are some embassy posts who may require 2 in-person appointments. We personally haven't experienced that, but it is possible that they could request an in-person appointment. But from what we've experienced, if they do want contact with the applicant before the interview, it'll usually be a phone call. London, our understanding is they don't do pre-appointment phone calls, and they just require the one visit. But documentation has to be presented in advance. Now, another thing about the timeline is you go through an interview, sometimes a pre-appointment phone call, then you go through that interview where you take the oath of renunciation. Then you will have to wait, usually a couple of months, to get the final certificate of loss of nationality. Now, even though it takes a few months to get that final certificate, which is issued through Washington, the effective date of renunciation is the date that you have appeared and taken the oath of renunciation in front of an embassy officer. So you're surrendering your US passport, you're taking that formal oath, and legally that is the day that you renounce. Now, embassy officers will sometimes bizarrely tell clients, Miss or Sir, do you know that you're still a US citizen until you get your certificate of loss of nationality? But we've challenged that, and that's not really accurate legally because they've renounced citizenship and given up passport. But it still takes a few months to get the final certificate, and you do want that in your records. Now, some ask, what if I need to travel between the time that I renounce citizenship and the time that I get my final certificate of loss of nationality? We tell them that they should travel with their foreign passport. They should apply for ESTA authorization if that's available to them. In some cases, they might have to apply for a visitor visa, which then becomes a little bit tricky if they haven't gotten their certificate of loss of nationality, but they could apply. But most of our clients are part of ESTA recognized countries, so they will be able to travel under ESTA. And maybe at that initial visit, a CBP officer, customs officer might say, Miss or Sir, you last entered, or each time you've entered before, you've had your US passport. Why do you no longer, where's your US passport? And they would simply have to explain that they no longer have it because they renounced citizenship. It's easier to give that explanation when you've got your certificate of loss of nationality, but you can still explain that to them and say that you have renounced citizenship. When you do finally get your certificate of loss of nationality, we always recommend holding on, scanning it so you have an electronic copy, sending it to your lawyer so they have a copy, and keeping it with you when you travel. Usually it's just the first few times that you enter the US as a foreign national would you be questioned, and after that it's smooth sailing, and you just enter as an ESTA visitor or with a visa. And also certainly if you apply for a visa, you want to present your certificate of loss of nationality. Will the government ever say no? I mean, generally that answer is no, unless they believe that it's purely motivated by tax avoidance or certainly sort of tax evasion. That's sort of more in IRS territory, but there could be further questioning, and potentially they could make the declaration that you'll no longer be able to apply for a visa. But the burden of proof is on the government, and to say that that's your sole reason for renouncing citizenship, and that's quite a high burden of proof. So the key takeaways here with renunciation of US citizenship is if you decide to renounce citizenship, it is an irreversible and irrevocable process. There are some exceptions there if you get some sort of judicial overturn, or if you're age 18 and you decide by age 18 and a half, you want to reverse the decision, you can do so. But generally speaking, you want to think that this is not going to be changeable, that this is a permanent decision. So it is quite serious. The other key takeaway is that, could restrict your freedom of movement and employment opportunities in the United States, because while you still might be able to travel to the US, if you need to work, then you would have to apply for work authorization. The other key takeaway is that it limits opportunities for family members to qualify for green cards, or in the case of children born abroad, they would not be eligible for transmission of citizenship, so effectively automatic US citizenship at birth. That's all I wanted to cover today in this brief time that we had together. I would like to open it up if anybody has any particular questions. They could send, I see a few in the chat right now, so let me just see if I can find this. Okay, so someone's been waiting for an appointment at the embassy since, wow, July 27, 2022. Do you think you'll get an appointment soon? Okay, so London is extremely backlogged. We're effectively avoiding London. We don't know why they have not put more resources into renunciation. my recommendation is you may want to consider other embassy posts, but now here's also something that we have discovered is we used to try to send or request appointments in maybe two or even three locations at once. We have discovered that they are now comparing notes to where if you put yourself on the waiting list in London, and then you decide, okay, let's let that tick along, and then you try to apply in France or Italy or somewhere else, they might know that you have applied in London or you're on the waiting list and might want you to withdraw from the waiting list. So you just have to be quite careful about that. So we don't even know what the backlog timeframe is for London. I have to just be honest and say we just know it's heavily backlogged, and we really don't know what's going on there. We know that they were catching up with appointments that were sort of booked during the pandemic. But I mean, you've been waiting for close to a year. So that's unusual. You might want to reach out to them to see why, what month are they on? Are they making appointments for June 2022 and they'll reach you soon? So that might give you an indication. Can you show a passport that's out of date? UK passport that's out of date? You can. You can definitely show a US passport that's out of date. I would advise getting a current passport, because that's a passport that you're showing them as evidence that you have dual nationality and you have another nationality to rely upon. I mean, an outdated UK passport doesn't mean you're not a UK citizen. It just means you need to renew your passport. But my view is you probably want to get a current passport. If you've got a third nationality and that's expired, I don't think that's a big deal, but I think you probably want one passport that is valid. Certainly if you're going to a country outside of the US, outside of the UK. Let's just say you go to Italy. Well, of course, you're going to need your UK passport to be valid to be able to travel in and out of Italy. So my suggestion is get that renewed. The other question here is, what sort of questions are asked at renunciation? Typically, they don't grill you because especially if they have that pre-appointment phone call. And they're going to ask you about your immigration history. How did you acquire US citizenship? How did you acquire your second or third citizenship? How long have you been living outside of the US? And they just want to get an understanding of your immigration history and why you've reached the decision that you have. And when do I lose my citizenship? Is it when I signed on the dotted line at the embassy or when the paperwork comes back? So yes, I addressed that briefly, which is, it is when you sign on the dotted line, when you take your oath of renunciation, raise your right hand in front of that officer and take the oath and sign the oath of renunciation is the legally effective date that you've renounced citizenship. So I think I've addressed all the questions here, very good questions. And it looks like we've run out of time here. I hope this was helpful to you. This was quite a broad, overarching bird's eye view of renunciation. And we've got a lot of experience in this area. And if you do need legal support, we'd be delighted to help. And I hope this was informative to you this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful day.